Thank you.
Great. Well, as I already said, this is a first, and I'm quite keen on learning by doing. So you better be keen on witnessing while I'm learning by doing, and I hope it's useful. I don't want to waste your time. I am holed up, and I think it's very who isn't holed up, but how odd to have to say where one is, which I don't want to do. But then we have these generic terms, so you can say in the city, and then we have these terrible terms, which I think Eric Hobsbawm talked about very well. When did country become the country? And of course we have the countryside. So I'm 100 miles outside London in an isolated spot, which is not quite as wonderful as this photograph, but is a cousin of it. And I think one of the things that interests me is how we find out about things. And I notice that students are always telling me that they've researched something. And I'm always slightly pissed off with it because I feel, no, you just found something and now you're calling it research. And I'm not sure at what level finding out becomes research. But I'm very keen on the accident of encounter. Is everything all right here?
I don't know. What's that?
We've got something funny in the screen. Sorry.
Yeah, were you ready?
Okay. So this picture is actually held by a person. I think it's held by Ray Mears in a television program. And this is how the loggers worked in the States. So they put up a tent and then do a kind of raw timber roof. I've forgotten what they're called. Begins with S. Anyway, shingles. Thank you. So they'd shingle the roof, and then hilariously, although perhaps it's not so hilarious, they would actually make a fence. And the fence, I would imagine, would have a lot of meanings. And of course, that fence, we, as metropolitans, we understand as curtilage. It's what you don't cross. But it obviously originates in animals and so forth. So I take a lot of pictures off the television. It's not great quality, but I like the fact that that came to me. So I'm near this sort of world, but I'm not in this sort of world. But of course, this sort of world delights me. It's who we all are. It's an endless attempt to resolve contingency, in-betweeniness. That what I think in Britain is pretty strong, which is that'll doism, and then mixed up with bits and pieces of what I think I now call off the internet. I guess what our class calls tropes. But really, I suppose what I'm really interested in is how do we read all of this stuff and how do we know public from private? And perhaps this period is pretty intense in that way because obviously public and private have collapsed. So tonight you've come into my shed with me. I can see some of you and I've got a sort of glimpse of this thing we call the home. So really how the world is assembled willy-nilly, but in fact, of course, we negotiate it. And you can be with a really quite young child and they can read this stuff. I'm being threatened by a cat, so I'm slightly nervous. So it's that part of the world where there are serious statements of ownership. And one of the things I think about a lot is what would it have been like to be involved in the enclosures? Where would I have been? Who would I have been? What did that mean? I'm not a trained historian, but I can see that the landscape as a kind of porous, open, even the fact that I just used the word the landscape, that land was this open thing, which over 150 years got chopped up and framed. And for most of us, we just get on with it. But because I've had so much more time on my hands, I've been thinking, how is that done and what does it mean? How am I threatened, intimidated? Where can I see a wagging finger? What is trespass? And I was sent this picture on the right, which I think is somebody trying very hard to deliver a sponge in a sort of COVID style through a gate, one way or the other. I've sent it by my son who lives in Bristol, and he told me that his daughter, my granddaughter, who is 5, is completely fascinated by those armored chains which discourage you from sitting on them. And I think, oh my God, she's in the gene pool. She's already wondering about little bits of violence hidden in the English landscape. So there's nothing here that you don't know. I think really probably what engages me is how swiftly this stuff is read and how quickly, in a way, this is a bit like being in group therapy. It's like fessing up to an illness of how I think about this far too much of the time, and for the greater part don't share it. It might be that my wife would wish I would shut up about it, but it is something to do with legibility, and I would say a very old-fashioned word, the make, how things are actually done. So the left-hand picture here is a John Nash bit of prettification of some land. That's the back gate. That's for animals. The gate was remade about 30 years ago by a proper blacksmith, who of course doesn't exist anymore. And then 3 or 4 days after taking that picture, I passed this extraordinary, I now know this is called a skeuomorph, where something is made to be like something which it is not. So you could argue that the Nash posts have a bit of timber reference in them, but not much. But this plasticky thing is completely, I don't know which plastic it is. We'd have to ask Zoe Laughlin, but it's an image of an image of an image. And of course, it's completely contemporary normal. And what I would call our class, that's with a small c, it is completely disgusting. And it's paid for with public money. It's on the public highway. And I'd never know where to locate my feelings. Does that make me a snob? Does it make me a Puritan? Does it make me slightly knowledgeable about materials and their uses and why they survive or fail? I don't know. And clearly, what we're living in at the moment is a kind of collision. It's like being in a very, very slow car crash, and none of us being able to our collective intelligence is very high, but our scientific knowledge is very low. So this whole question of how things are legible, who made them, what does it mean that they're made in a certain way, what has been done to them since they were made, what's happening to them, what is decay, what is patina, and what are these, what we might call buy-in images, which I suppose have developed throughout my lifetime. I'm 72, so I'm a child of the Formica kitchen table. The man who keeps coal behind this red wall is a very direct. You could find him in This Country television series, you might know. He's very direct. In a funny way, I'm quite fond of him, but all our exchanges are at the very edge of what I would call rude, but that could be the French rude, as in a bit rough. And I never quite know where they are, but I've known him for a long time. And I was taking this picture and he asked me why I was taking the picture. And I said, well, I've always admired the energy to paint one side of the corrugated red and how beautiful the drips were down the back. And of course, I got a lecture about, well, why would anyone bother to paint the back? Look, it's really impossible to do it. And of course, I was immediately drowning in my own, I don't know whether that's aestheticism or what it is, but we were not going to meet in this conversation. And of course, that's mixed up with other things which we see every day, which are sort of the small generosities and inventions. This is a builder's, please don't come in, or let me park here, or what. However, again, how do we read that? But on the edge of the public and the private. Thomas Cook's letterbox on the left, which we could, maybe in Mesopotamia, they might have measured things in duct tape, a 3 duct tape letterbox, but a powerful way to say we're not in business anymore. And something completely different, but sort of strangely, another of those unitary moments where you think, I mean, the dreaded word, the countryside is just full of the most extraordinary shit. The McDonald's tin can. I'm not being righteous about it. It's that it's. I guess if you're a bit partial to archaeology, it's sort of wonderful. So I don't know whether these are Mr. Kipling or what they are, but they're kind of course, essentially they're brick molds in a gutter. And I suppose all of this is tied up with a very strong feeling about absence. That humans, I don't know who the audience is tonight, but I could argue, well, I'm nearer the furnace doors than you are because I'm in my 70s. And whatever COVID is, it's certainly mischievous. So it can come for me swiftly or maybe not. So I think there's a kind of metaphor that we all, or that is a metaphor for something which we all inhabit all the time, which is really a questions of absence and reading things that have been or things that are not or things that could be. And it's like an inside out pictoriality. That's a horrible word, but it's a kind of nonness, which I have a feeling in the last weeks has been heightened. And I have to say that none of these pictures are taken with very much, I mean, obviously I know that taking a photograph is not looking, and that a photograph has edges and it can be cropped, and it's a construction, and it's got a long history, and these were taken with a phone. But I want to emphasize that these things are found. They're much more like brain spillage. They're not hunted, and the way they come together and make these pairs has quite a high level of happenstance. But they're all within the last 4 or 5 weeks. Into all of this, I think, is a feeling which is used in an upside down way by our disgusting governments, which is to do with inventiveness and resourcefulness.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So I only saw this 5-bar gate the other day, and I really admired. I mean, I've no idea who the author is. It's one of those suburbanized villages where the emphasis is mostly on where to park a car. And of course, I'm old enough to remember when there weren't any cars in villages. There were bicycles and a bus. And if I sound righteous, I don't mean to. I'm just meaning I'm old enough to have seen change. But the kind of inventiveness that turns the 5-bar gate into a sort of 5-bar door is a cousin of a gate which I see really a lot, which is the one on the right with the puddle. where the farm machinery has got bigger. It's made the opening impossible, which has obviously got a long history. The opening's been made bigger, and then somewhere on the farm was some piece of stuff, a bit of galvanized 4-bar stuff, which is in fact exactly the right interval for a ladder. So the desperation to resolve the gate, probably not 6 months ago, is now my way of climbing the gate on the wrong side. And I think we overemphasize what I would call self-conscious invention. I think there is something lovely that everybody's experiencing at the moment about resourcefulness. And that can be incredibly modest. It can be, I don't like gravel in front of my door, so I'm going to have a little bit of a little cementy slab, or I want to change the roof and the railway has arrived and I know where to get bricks. Before we were in, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm sure somebody will have written about this, but I think matching is incredibly interesting, that things should match. And matchingness is, I grew up with a lot of matching, or it certainly was discussed. A shopping list found in the middle of nowhere. I will probably send that to Neil McGregor. I mean, I think that's a fine, brilliant, modest, you know, the fact that we can read the handwriting, we deduce various things about the handwriting. I think it's a woman. I think it's a young woman. So lots of things to do with inscription and all the meanings that inscription has. So, I mean, I'm not an Alec Clifton Taylor. How dare somebody point a wall with the wrong Portland cement, although I'm able to see it. But how sweet that there's a WH 1833, which is tiny, high up in the wall, which is still somehow valued. And 1833 sort of, to me, seems almost obtainable. If you go backwards from my birth by 72 years, so you can do the maths yourself, at 72, going back from 1947, that gets you to, I think, about 1870. So you can, a lifetime will get you other lives, or certainly what spans of time do. And I know very little about architecture, but I know quite a lot about building, and I like looking and understanding the survival of stuff and how it gets there, you know, where it's made, how it's made. I can more or less remember these big water canisters being invented, and the ability to move them, to move water around in an incredibly economic way. I did want to say at the beginning of this that I think underlying why I put these pictures together is a sort of question about who do you walk with, who are the people who inhabit your head, and whose heads do you inhabit. So most of the people in these pictures are dead or properly old. But I would have in here people I've never met, like Roland Barthes. I'd have David Pye. I would probably have Joseph Reichert, whose name was on the door when I became a student in 1966, in the same class as James Dyson, discuss. People who maybe I've only exchanged very, very few words with, but who affect how you see and how you think. And I think Joseph Reichert was actually probably only a name on a door, and I probably remembered it because it's a Scrabble name. It's like, wow, what's that? And now I know Joseph not very well, but well enough to feel very fond of him. But right up the other end, the sort of people who could be walking with me might be Hans Ulrich, who I knew when he first came to London, who is that Hans Ulrich, or more or less the same time, Tom Sachs, or a little bit later, Tom Emerson, or people who I sort of talk to mostly by WhatsApp. I don't have Instagram or anything, but bits of conversation with Rowan Moore, Stephen Witherford, for the greater part, people who I think are interested in how the world is assembled and what it means. So I think I've probably said most of the things I want to say. I think this feeling of, there's this term, the adopted highway. And the adopted highway means that it's in public ownership. But I'm always amazed at, what does that mean, public ownership? Whose public ownership? Who maintains what? And I think it's important to say, again, without sort of trying to sound like an old geezer, but I grew up with an electricity board, a water board, a gas board. The GPO was indistinguishable. That's the post office. Was indistinguishable from the BBC. They were painted khaki and had similar trucks because they were to do with communications. So that evaporation of legibility, when none of us really know what anything is or where it comes from or who to speak to, which is obviously very central to the politic of the last weeks. A famous person, or a celebrity, I think is the word, is responsible for the picture on the right. That's there, as one might say, they're turning. So we're looking down a private road. And it's probably one of the ugliest corners I know. And I think, what a funny thing to be able to do that. And by almost the reverse, the dumb humility of the desperation to achieve certain things, that this is old railway land, there's no station for a long way, but there are bits of rail line that rock up. There was also once a canal. So there's that language, and it also was military. So there's lots and lots of visible leftovers. And then really weird things. I'm extremely fond of, there's a farm with piles of these tied together tires, which they use in a sort of military way. They must have been something you could buy on the Exchange and Mart or something. God knows what they weigh. And they're used as obstructions. But you seldom see anything as good as that in American art of the 60s and 70s, although, of course, it's a cousin. And I don't know who here or who isn't here has ever worked with barbed wire, but imagine a world where there wasn't any barbed wire. So I guess that's about 1840. So that's what you might call a pre-wire landscape. Really making barbed wire do that on a gate is shocking, and I admire whoever did it, but I also can feel the swiftness, the communication that is there. And this is in open country. I mean, there are towns nearby, but it's in open country. And then the inevitable, we really don't know what to do, and we don't really want to throw anything away, and we like it the way it was. And there's a lovely man at the Pitt Rivers called Dan Hicks, who's an archaeologist of the present. I mean, he's somebody I would be very happy to spend half an hour with some students investigating this arrangement of what isn't a standing stone, but I think is probably a stone as a gatepost, which then became a timber gatepost, and what I would say was oak, and then became an oak gate, etc., etc. And then there's, I think it's called tannalized softwood gate at the back. And of course, it's all lingo. We're nearly at the end. This was the treat of my week, going for longer walks books and realizing how kind lichen is. That lichen will do what lichen wants to do to whatever lichen finds. And a bit of asbestos cement roof can quite happily settle down in the top of a dry stone wall. The inexplicable but true. That frame has something on the end which says something like Chinese ceramic floor tiles from Wicks, or you can imagine it's a crate, but it's dumped, left, thrown, but that's as is. And I already mentioned that this is a military landscape, so there's a lot of concrete posts with real, when we had a Ministry of War, before we had a, don't laugh, Defense Ministry, there's a lot of that language of 1935, 1960 production, all in a state of really ready for the archaeologists. And then there's, well, it's not quite right, but it's good enough for me, which of course, if I sound snippy, I'm not. I even explaining myself feel slightly emotional. I think there's a terrific truth in these things, and they normally, my pleasure would be private. The other thing I meant to say was that I remember being told that the horizon at sea is always 8 miles away, which I think is a gorgeous idea. And I guess you'd be unwise to go and check it out in your swimming trunks. But I quite like the way that gates and fences sometimes talk to horizons. More gates, but these are the up-to-date variety and up-to-date walls. And in a way, they're in a perfect conversation with the size of farm machinery, which is probably dictated in Kansas. I even know somebody whose family money comes from farm machinery. And I always think how strange, that I remember reading once that the German Industrial Revolution in the 1870s was probably made possible by whoever invented the reaper, because without the reaper, you wouldn't be able to move the quantities of wheat from Kansas to the industrializing German cities. And those equivalents, I mean, that's very Eric Hobsbawm, but those things are very important to me, and they make me quite forgiving by somebody's desire to make a suburban fortress. I'll finish by saying that I think one of the strangest things about this time for me is how evanescent it is, how fugitive it is, how things are running away from us all, and we're trying to catch them. And all we can do is to talk to each other. That's the best we can do. We've probably done more scraping around in family history in 6 weeks than we would ever have done. Not to draw up great charts, but just sort of understanding stuff. And I suppose this slightly post-AIDS adoption of the rainbow is quite odd to me. I don't think I was ever very good at them as a child or anything, but we've got an old prism from I think it's probably from a tank periscope, and about twice a day it just has a word with the floor, and if you're lucky and you're passing, the prism just stays where it is, the sun does what it does, it's moving around quite a lot. But this is our little domestic shrine for about 5 minutes ago. Thank you all very, very much.
Do we stop share here?
Yes, why don't you do that? Yeah. Richard, maybe I could ask a question kind of just to kick us off, but it'd be great if there's others.
Just tell me one thing. Other people in the top row, I recognize some of them. Some of them I feel incredibly fond of. And then there are some I don't know. Are they all the people that watching, or are there more people?
There are many more people. We have 79 people at the moment.
Okay, no, it's just completely illegible to me. So it's that funny thing about, hello, everybody. Oh, that's nice. I recognize names, if not faces.
I'm going to ask a question before sort of pitching over to Rosie to sort of manage everyone else's. I mean, something of the format, Richard, sort of was reminding me a little of watching Patrick Keeler's films. You know, they're having these static images and your dulcet tones kind of over the top.
It's a pity I'm not him.
Both, I'm enthused about both of you. And I guess in Patrick's work, there's a very focused investigation into the problem of England. You're kind of showing, a lot of the images you showed are, in a sense, very primary acts of territorialization. But I wonder to what extent the picture that you've been showing is one you see as a specifically English one. You know, would you think comparable phenomena would be you could detect if we were in Italy or France or Germany?
Well, I'm English and unhappy being English, but there's nothing you can do about that. And like Rasmussen said, they want to come from the south. So I like to go south. It's very interesting about the Patrick thing because we're about the same age. We know each other. Patrick really does is properly grounded in politics. I would say with a small and a big P. And I think I come from very small P. I mean, I understand, that outside cities you have vernaculars and inside cities you have the polis, and they're different. But of course, I've lived through this period where the two have started to chatter in a way that is very striking and is now the absolute the unsheet anchor of our politics. I mean, it's the great disturber of our politics. So I think I don't quite know what to do. I quite like doing a talk like this, if only to admit that I don't know how to theorize it, other than to say, of course I notice the strange aggression with which, I mean, what a funny thing to cover up a drain with a bit of astroturf. I mean, I just, I mean, there's a lot of energy in doing that. You've got to get the astroturf for a start, and then you've got to cut it to size. But then I'm very interested in the fact that we're fallible and we are made of foibles, and we recognize that in each other. And it might be, I've never said this publicly, but it might be that I grew up in one of those 1950s, 1960s fault-finding households, which seems to cover all the classes, who brought their muddy feet indoors, who lost the dog, who left the top off the milk, da, 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 da. And maybe one resolution for me was to see that the world was funny. So I probably come more from a Jacques Tati disposition. And it might be that I'm slightly amazed how easily I get fed. I mean, I promise you, I don't go out looking for this stuff. So I feel often that I'm being stalked. I have extremely high levels of coincidence, most of which are delightful, some of which are represented by some of the people listening. I would say that I think one of the things that's really interesting about being a human is that you read the public and the private wherever you are. And if you're reasonably adjusted or curious, you can handle it. And I would say it is very, very different. I mean, the very fact that Italy has been attacked so badly by COVID seems to have something to do with their public adoration of proximity. Obviously, it's not as simple as that, but at least this time asks us all these questions about, it's not really asking us who we are and how we live and how we behave. And as somebody said to me today, I miss the smell of people I don't like. That was in an email. And I agree, so do I.
We've got a question from Andrew. I'm going to unmute you, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Richard. Nice to see you from a distance.
Are you on the water?
I'm not today. I'm not on the boat. I'm taking care of my brother's flat while he's out of the country. So no, not on the boat today. But my question was about some things that you just touched on, actually. Because a lot of your work is about this, making do and getting by, this idea of a massive amount of chaos, disorganization that is somehow slightly ameliorated by these little introductions, the teacup in the window, that kind of thing. And a lot of the images that you showed today were about fences and about borders and about this public-private thing that we're having problems with at the moment. And so the question is about if you're thinking about that more, if you're seeing that more, and then if your own work is about this sense of control, of border, or if it is more a Jacques Tati sort of pointing at how ridiculous that attempt at control actually is.
That's a lovely question. I think I would hate to go down in history as a pointer out of silliness. But we are silly. I think that, to be a human is to be, I can see your head at the moment. You might be wearing your pajamas. I don't know. That's one of one of the pleasures of the last weeks has been the collision of self-esteem and self-regard. That if I see another Tory minister with leather-bound sets of books behind them, I may have to just go and get COVID. It's too disturbing. So I think as I already said, my work or what I do is really not theorized. It's because I have an understanding of materials and I know usually what they are. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested how they got there. When I saw the gate post made of a railway line, it's not the first time I've seen that, but that happens to be nowhere near a railway line, so that had to be brought there. But so is a dry stone wall. It used to be made of freestone. It used to be made of the stuff that they had to get off the land because the land was so crap. And it ended up at the edge, and then they had sheep. So the meaning, we don't really know the meaning of most things because the meaning is migrating all the time. And I guess I'm more interested in the fact that we are all the time witnessing how migratory we are to each other and how migratory the way we make the world is. I think it's the cruelest thing for a particular type of architect who will be distressed because the world is going to adjust whatever arrangements they have designated or dictated, and designate is only the verb of design. How frightening it must be when you see somebody fuck it up. And I'm obviously able to think both ways at once. I'm a split personality. My wife luckily has left the room and she doesn't need to hear me say that. But thank you. I think Jacques Tati, there's a huge weight of sympathy in Jacques Tati that is really, that is not funny, the pathos of it. And of course, that's a culture with a very, very strong sense of the bourgeoisie. People still talk in France, they still talk about the aristocracy.
He puts himself in it. He's living in it. He's always in his films. He's really connected to it.
But of course, the envy there is that he is then, I think the first Jacques Tati film I really understood was probably Traffic or Playtime. What do I mean by understand? But I was already 20, 25.
A question from James Payne, who's on Nina's account. So I'm just going to unmute you, James.
Am I doing this right?
Hi, Richard. Yeah, sorry, it's a bit confusing because I'm under the wrong name. We met last year in Cambridge. We did a crit together.
Yes, I recognise you, but you've grown your hair.
It's a lockdown.
You've grown one of mine.
I'm really glad that you're safe in the countryside, but I do almost feel it's a shame that you're missing out on the very strange things happening here in the city. Just the kind of the human comedy, and very much a Jacques Tati way of going around a park in London. We live next to Greenwich Park, and it's extraordinary, the things, the scenes, and I think with your acute sensibility, just the way, just to see the way the dance macabre of people kind of on a narrow pavement and then suddenly stepping out into the road, or police people, mounted police telling people to stop sunbathing, or just all of the different paths that have appeared throughout Greenwich Park. Like just suddenly one path has become three paths, and people are climbing up incredibly steep hills that they never, it's extraordinary what's happening to the landscape and people's just kind of interaction. And I wish you were here to see it. Well,
I think it would be, like all of us, I think it would be true to say that my not there-ness was hardly a choice. It was it was almost an accident, because I was seeing my grandchildren in Bristol, blah, 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 and then a choice had to be made. And that, like there are for many people, there are two of us, the choice was made without, I'm sure this is very common, without understanding what the consequences would be. So you then have to start living with, I mean, maybe some people understood that they're going to be there for 4 months. I don't know. I'm sure there are going to be people very competitive and go, oh, I understood that perfectly. I've stored toilet paper for 100 years. But in a way, the edgelessness of all decision-making, I would estimate that anyone in this group tonight is in the top 0.1% of intelligence. And I don't mean the cleverest people in the land. I just mean that everybody that we're spending time with knows a lot about choice, plays with choice, and they may have arrived at that by dozens of different ways. They might be capital P privileged. They might be, there are so many ways at arriving at that territory. And when we last met, you see that with students and you go, my God, that person, they could be an actor. You see all that versatility, not for everybody, but enough people. So we're a very odd group. And I have had to send pleas to friends, send me some Metropolis. So even getting the sponge on the gate from Bristol, which is hardly a metropolis, was a sort of...
Can I send you some pictures of paths, worn paths?
Yes, send me anything. Because I also think this is an incredibly important... I do think, obviously, it's not that this is not Playtime. That's not a reference to the film. This is a really unusual period where anyone who's interested in society is given the chance to really think about it. From my 5-year-old granddaughter, I can see her pumping away. She doesn't see the enormity of this, but she is pumping away. So in one way, we're in the best educational I'm making gestures of compression. We're in a kind of lockdown school of really every little vanity we ever had is being questioned. And I would like to be, in what are obviously the last years of my life, I'd like to be useful. I mean, I've lived the greater part of what I'll get given. But it's then, how is it to be useful? And maybe this is a small little, to propel these conversations. Thank you, though.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Philip Christo, you're up next.
Hi, Richard. Can you hear me?
I can. How nice to see you.
Hi, Richard.
Really
That's
like
very
a
good.
dinner
Thank
party.
you. Thank you. That was a nice little show. I have a question for you. What's your opinion or your prediction? Do you have an idea if this experience that we're going through now is going to make fundamental change in the world and in our lives, or are things going to go back to normal and just forget it?
I think there's no normal. I think that's what is both horrifying and exhilarating. I think whatever normal, which is one of those words which I think all of us would be very nervous to use, even when we say Richard's not quite normal. I think this is unbelievably radical because it just asks so many questions. And I received an email today from somebody who was editing something that we had done together. And they said that there was a recording in which where I think they said to me, "Who was that you just embraced?" So somebody, it's not a word I would normally use, but I'd obviously greeted somebody I knew in London at the British Library. I don't know who it was, sometime in February. Could have been you. You would be warm to that person, or if circumstances are right, you demonstrate that. And this email said, "This seems so exotic. It seems incredible, that this word embrace was used." So from that to every single act of transaction, I mean, every economic smallie and biggie that we ever understood, most of us, I'm sure, could talk quite vigorously about what capitalism is, how it got invented, why it worked, what it did, how it's performed, how it can be very cruel, how it can enable things. We have, again, I sort of feel Eric Hobsbawm lurking. We haven't come up with anything much better, but it's crap. And I have to say, I really want to witness what it is. And I feel that in order to witness it, I have to live for at least another 10 or 15 years. And I'm not sure I'll get given that. But I can at least, I mean, it is exciting in the sense that it's horrifying. It's exciting. And I'm reading Robert Graves' Farewell to All That at the moment. I'm about halfway through. And the unbelievable eloquence with which he describes being in the trenches and being amongst the dead. And I mean, but you almost don't realize what you've read. I mean, I do recommend it quite. It's sort of beautifully horrible.
Yeah. I mean, the banking crisis in 2008, everything just, it's almost like it didn't happen, huh? It just, everything went completely
Well,
back.
it didn't happen, but it sort of did if you knew what to look for. I think, understanding the complete lack of promise in so many people's lives, the lack of, what does it mean to look for, it's a term of greeting, isn't it? I was looking forward to seeing you. It's got a lot of, and we face the front, forward. I mean, we've got these things called faces. They're on the front of us. For the greater part, we don't like to go back. So there's a lot of I think a lot about how propelled humans are, and obviously, if you've got access to children in any way, relations or I like children. I mean, what a weird thing to be a child. They can do nothing other than look forward. But I never lived forward to a room. I mean, whatever's going on at the moment and not visible. They're definitely not doing Zoom. Well, not with me. And of course, you can hear my shame.
Okay.
We've got a question from Simon Jones. I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, Simon.
Hello.
I just recommended your talk to my son.
Strange medium. I'd never heard of Zoom before a few weeks ago.
You thought it was something you had to pay to go and see, and it's near Regent's Park.
Thanks. Fantastic slides amongst those. And as I was sort of wondering, as somebody who appreciates resourcefulness, during lockdown, lots of people have had to make do without the things that they usually can get hold of easily. I was wondering whether you think people are going to have a different outlook on resourcefulness after all this.
Well, it's funny because you're the right person to ask me that question, because I've had a very dark thought. So if you're born when I'm born, I'm not meaning to go on about it, but we are born in time and in circumstances and in a place, and we grow up with a kind of arc of probably what the child calls normal, because they don't know anything else. Really, until I was 35, there were things called junk shops and army surplus, and they meant what they said. They weren't antique stores, and they might have antiques in them that got a bit knocked about, but they were junk shops. There were no charity shops, and an army surplus store, which I can think of half a dozen just by saying it, would have army surplus. And one of the things I've found very, very strange in the last 10 years, 20, 15 years, is this thing called retro. And retro seems to me to be the necessary aestheticization of what was the kind of wallpaper for my generation. You know, I found this, I've mended the leg. Actually, I now realize it's Bauhaus, so it doesn't matter. So quite dumb mending. And Conran comes out of that, really. Conran is the senior figure for turning that into a kind of, you know, his stripped pine came from Yugoslavia, but it was still talking to all of that. So we've now lived through this period of make it look old, you know, fiddling with rust, whatever. I mean, I'm sure somebody's written a book about it. And it's been very odd for me to watch because I recognize it. I know I usually can identify what something is, but I've wondered what it really means to the generation that has no choice but to live with it. And presumably that's then a choice, which means it's not IKEA. So I now have been thinking, oh my God, that was a terrible metaphor. All of that was, this is the look you're going to live with because you're going to be using things that are fucked up and you're going to have to mend them and you're going to learn to mend them. And I haven't thought that through. It's because I just wondered what was all that rustiness? What was all that, you know, 4 layers of paint and the bare metal showing, and you know, and you know, what is patina? These are things I think about anyway. What is patina? And I do detect a kind of curiosity about how things are made again. But of course, the terms in which things are made has changed completely. So I'm guessing you grew up with slotted screws. You probably saw a brace and bit as a child, or a Black & Decker drill with an orange cable with sparks that flew out of the drill when it started, and a chuck key that would get lost. And you know, that really holds water until about 1985. I can remember my children being just thrilled by my first battery drill. And that feeling of how the world is now made, the fact that you can hear a battery drill in the middle of a field, and somebody's screwing together a fence for cattle, because that's how good that technology got. So there are lots of really interesting questions about the hand and the intention and the need and, dare I say it, the aesthetic. Is that anything like the answer you thought I'd give?
Yeah, but I guess in a way, it feels like a lot of people have become quite accepting of having to do things, and maybe even sort of quite enjoying the limitations of it, I guess in a way that they wouldn't have tolerated before. And I wonder if that's something that will continue, or will
well, if you would know that because you're younger, you would know that better, or you would be more of a witness of it. I mean, there's hardly a new thing where I am at the moment, but then I never was particularly interested in capital N, capital T, new things. But, you know, I think that when you really analyze all of that, I mean, one of the phrases I use is the pre-fridge freezer world. So how did Grenfell catch fire? A freezer had a fault. Well, it wasn't designed for freezers. It's not the fault of Grenfell. It's not really the fault of the freezer. We could discuss that endlessly. But this is one of the things that's so complicated about our conduct, because we live constantly in what is, with a small r, in a retro world where, you know, aspects of how we live fail, or new things come in which demand, you know, better, I'm not even sure how to say it, you know, better digital reception. You can tell I don't really know how to say that. I'm getting embarrassed.
We just have one more question from Nastya. I'm going to unmute you now.
All right, the rest could be by email perhaps, but not all at once.
Nastya? Okay, I think she's gone. So I'm going to ask the question, but she was asking, how do you think your creativity has influenced modern architecture in terms of the aestheticization of vernacular modernity?
Oh my God.
Very difficult one to
Trick question. Well, for a start, and I want to be really vehement about this, I would be really happy if somebody's got a recording of this. I'm really not, I'm not trying to sell something. It's not an aesthetic. It's much more a curiosity about, well, I mean, it's sort of shocking to me that all those beautiful 5-bar gates, which are no longer made of timber, but are, you know, adequately engineered. They're not much better than adequately engineered. They're nearly all fucked because something's driven into them. They're nearly all in a state of not very interesting distortion. I mean, if they were really run over, I would probably quite enjoy them. So I think her question, is it a her? The woman, is it a woman who asked the question? Sorry?
I think she's gone now, but yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean, I think the question is interesting because it's not an aesthetic question. It is, or for me, it's not an aesthetic question. It's a kind of maybe I want to remind, we'll assume she's a third of my age, so we'll just deal with the fact that I might meet this person, I might know this person and not recognize their name. But I would hope never to say that my way was the right way, or I think that kind of didactic capital T teaching is terrifying. I think I'm really interested in pointing out that everything is in a condition of failure. You know, from the moment you get your new phone, it's going wrong. That was true for the motor car. It was true for the Wright brothers. It's true for everything. And of course, there's a metaphor, which is that we are aging and falling to pieces, and we're in the biggest metaphor we ever had, the biggest collective metaphor. So I could point to conversations where I know there's value in the conversation. And I originally suggested doing this together with Tom Emerson, who's a great friend. But then I thought it would get so complicated. Maybe we have to do that another night, because this is, you know, I have never done Zoom before. but it's a touching question. I mean, I would like to be of use. I don't really want to be influential.
I mean, this lecture has been amazing, I thought. I think everyone in the room thinks that as well. And yeah, we need to get you back with Tom as well.
We can get invented.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone. We have one more thing left this evening, Bedtime Story with Jane Rendell at 9 p.m.
One thing.
Sure, yeah.
Very quick. Just to say, I'd like to thank Jane, my wife, who absolutely is not an artist's wife. So it's a really rare thing for us to collaborate on something. And I couldn't have done this without the way that she helped. And also because I recognized lots of people who showed up. And in a way, you know, I'm pretty social. I mean, I'm not somebody who has huge dinner parties or anything, but I need my head to be populated by other people. So tonight has been quite a pleasure for me, and I hope I have been of use. Thank you all.
I'm going to unmute.
Thank you.
Yeah, support on that, yeah. Hey, so.
Well, if things could talk, and I'm sure
This is
you'd
in
hear
prison again, bro.
lot of
Yeah, this
things
is in
that make you
prison.
cry, my dear. Ain't you glad?
Loads of jokes people in there.